It was conducted across 15 hospitals in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Austria. It enrolled 2,060 patients who had suffered cardiac arrest, and it was designed to answer a single question that science had been avoiding for centuries. This episode is about what the science, the ancient traditions, and the deepest mystical teachings on earth have to say about the question, what matters more than any other question you will ever ask? What really happens when you die? Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today's episode is the Resurrection Machine. What really happens when you die? On the 7th of October, 2014, the results of the largest clinical study of human consciousness at the point of death were published in the journal Resuscitation. The study was called Awareness During Resuscitation. It was conducted across 15 hospitals in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Austria. It enrolled 2,060 patients who had suffered cardiac arrest, and it was designed to answer a single question that science had been avoiding for centuries. Does consciousness survive the death of the body? The study found that among cardiac arrest survivors, 46% reported a broad range of mental experiences during the period when they were clinically dead, when their hearts had stopped, when blood flow to the brain had ceased, when every measurable indicator of brain function had gone silent. These experiences included vivid perceptions of events in the room, encounters with deceased relatives, passage through a tunnel toward a brilliant light, and a panoramic review of their entire life experienced from a perspective of moral evaluation. 2% exhibited full awareness, verified, timed, and corroborated awareness of events that were occurring around their dead body. One patient described in precise detail the actions of the medical team during the 3 minutes after his heart had stopped. His account was verified against the medical record. It was accurate. The lead researcher, Dr. Sam Parnia of NYU Langone Medical Center, said something that should have made headlines around the world. He said that the dying brain appears to remove its own natural inhibitory systems, the brakes that ordinarily constrain awareness, and that this disinhibition opens access to new dimensions of reality, including lucid recall of all stored memories from early childhood to death. He used the phrase new dimensions of reality. A physician at a major research university in a peer-reviewed journal describing what happens when the brain flatlines. This episode is about what the science, the ancient traditions, and the deepest mystical teachings on earth have to say about the question, what matters more than any other question you will ever ask? What really happens when you die? The scientific investigation of death experiences began in 1975 when Dr. Raymond Moody published Life After Life, a book that collected and categorized the accounts of 150 people who had been clinically dead and returned. Moody identified a consistent pattern of elements that appeared across cultures, ages, religions, and circumstances: separation from the body, movement through a tunnel, encounter with a brilliant light, meeting deceased relatives, a life review, a boundary or point of return, and a profound reluctance to come back. The book was a sensation, but the scientific establishment dismissed it. The accounts were anecdotal. They were retrospective. They were self-reported. They could be explained, critics argued, by oxygen deprivation, hallucination, temporal lobe seizures, endorphin release, or the dying brain's last gasp of random neural firing. But the pattern refused to go away. Over the next 2 decades, researchers across multiple countries independently documented the same elements. Kenneth Ring at the University of Connecticut studied 102 near-death survivors and found the identical pattern. Michael Sabum, a cardiologist in Atlanta, interviewed cardiac arrest patients and found that those who reported out-of-body experiences during resuscitation described the medical procedures performed on them with an accuracy that far exceeded what they could have known through normal sensory channels. One patient described in precise detail a surgical instrument that had been used during his operation, a tool he had never seen before, and that had been introduced to the operating room after he was unconscious. The skeptical explanations, oxygen deprivation, endorphins, temporal lobe seizures, each had a fatal flaw. Oxygen deprivation produces confusion, disorientation, and fragmented perception. Near-death experiences produce the opposite: hyperclarity, accelerated thought, panoramic memory access, and logical coherence that patients describe as exceeding their normal waking consciousness. Endorphin release produces a pleasant but vague euphoria. NDEs produce structured, sequential narrative experiences with specific variable details. Temporal lobe seizures produce repetitive, stereotyped episodes. NDEs are unique, deeply personal, and contain information the patient could only have obtained from a vantage point outside their body. Every proposed material explanation failed to account for the totality of the data. And so the question remained: if the brain is dead, what is doing the experiencing? The question went unanswered for 25 years until a Dutch cardiologist named Pim van Lommel decided to settle it with the kind of rigorous prospective research that the skeptics had demanded. In 1988, van Lommel initiated a prospective study across 10 Dutch hospitals. This was critical. Prospective meant he was enrolling patients before they had their experience, eliminating the selection bias that had plagued all previous research. He included 344 consecutive cardiac arrest patients who were successfully resuscitated. He interviewed them within days of their resuscitation, then followed up at 2 years and again at 8 years. The results published in The Lancet in December of 2001 sent shockwaves through the medical community. 62 patients, 18%, reported a near-death experience. 41 of those described a core experience with multiple classical elements. And here's the finding that devastated the conventional explanation. The occurrence of the experience showed zero correlation with the duration of cardiac arrest, the duration of unconsciousness, the medications administered, or the patient's fear of death before the arrest. If oxygen deprivation caused these experiences, then every patient who was clinically dead should have reported one. Only 18% did, and the depth and vividness of the experience showed zero correlation with how long the brain had been deprived of oxygen. Van Lommel wrote something that belongs in the permanent record of human knowledge. He wrote, "There appears to be an inverse relationship between the clarity of consciousness and the loss of brain function. The worse the brain was doing, the clearer and more vivid the conscious experience became. That is the opposite of what every model of brain-generated consciousness would predict." The 8-year follow-up revealed something equally extraordinary. Patients who had a near-death experience were permanently and profoundly transformed. They showed decreased fear of death, increased belief in an afterlife, increased empathy, increased social engagement, and a measurable shift in values away from material concerns and toward meaning, connection, and spiritual understanding. These changes persisted and deepened over the entire 8-year follow-up period. Patients who survived cardiac arrest without an NDE showed none of these changes. Something happened to these people during those minutes of clinical death that changed them permanently, something real, something that a hallucination or a random neural discharge would be incapable of producing. Then came AWARE, 2 iterations, the largest and most rigorous studies of consciousness at the point of death ever conducted. AWARE 1, published in 2014, was a 4-year study across 15 hospitals, enrolling 2,060 cardiac arrest patients. The study design was ingenious. Researchers placed hidden visual targets, images on shelves near the ceiling in resuscitation rooms. If patients who reported floating above their body during cardiac arrest were genuinely perceiving the room from an elevated position, they should be able to identify these targets. The study also conducted structured interviews with survivors to categorize and analyze the content of their experiences. The results confirmed the core finding of Van Lommel's study. A significant percentage of cardiac arrest survivors reported structured, vivid mental experiences during the period of clinical death. 46% reported mental experiences during the arrest, 9% had experiences consistent with near-death experiences, and 2% exhibited full awareness, verified awareness of events occurring while they were dead. The most remarkable case involved a 57-year-old man who experienced cardiac arrest and was unconscious for 3 minutes. During that time, he reported rising out of his body and observing the medical team from a corner of the room near the ceiling. He described specific actions taken by the staff, specific sounds from the equipment, and the timing of specific events. Every detail he reported was independently verified against the medical record and the testimony of the staff present. His brain was receiving zero blood flow. His EEG, if it had been measured, would have been flat, and he was watching his own resuscitation with a clarity and accuracy that surpassed what a fully conscious observer standing in the room could have reported. Aware 2, published in 2023, went further. This time the study incorporated real-time EEG monitoring during CPR itself. They measured what the brain was actually doing the minutes of cardiac arrest, and they found something that no one predicted: spikes of organized electrical activity, gamma waves, beta waves, and alpha waves, appearing in brains that were clinically dead. These are the same brainwave patterns associated with conscious thought, memory recall, and lucid awareness in healthy waking brains. The dying brain was producing the electrical signature of heightened consciousness during the very period when it should have been producing nothing at all. The Aware 2 researchers also reported something that had never been systematically documented before. A significant percentage of survivors described the experience of dying as peaceful, profoundly peaceful. Many described a sensation of separation from the body that felt like relief, as though the weight of physical existence had been lifted and consciousness was free to expand in ways that the body had been preventing. Others described accessing memories from their entire lifetime, childhood events, forgotten conversations, moments of kindness, and moments of cruelty, all experienced simultaneously, as though the linear structure of time had collapsed and every moment of their life existed at once, available for review from a perspective of complete moral clarity. This life review element is one of the most consistent features across all NDE research, and it carries an implication that is worth sitting with. The dying consciousness goes far beyond replaying events. It evaluates them. Survivors consistently report experiencing every moment of their life from the perspective of the other person in the interaction. They feel what the other person felt, the joy they caused, the pain they caused, the love they gave, the love they withheld. The life review is a complete empathic accounting of every relational moment in the person's entire existence. If this is real, and the convergent data from Van Lommel, Parnia, Moody, Ring, Sabam, and dozens of other researchers over 5 decades suggest it is, then the life review constitutes the most powerful argument for compassion ever documented by science. Everything you do to another person, you will eventually experience from their perspective. Everything. Dr. Parnia concluded that the flatlined brain appears to remove its natural inhibitory systems, and that this disinhibition may open access to dimensions of reality that are ordinarily suppressed during the normal waking life. He described the findings as evidence of a real yet little understood dimension of human consciousness that becomes uncovered with death. And here's where the picture gets truly interesting, because while cardiologists and resuscitation scientists were documenting consciousness surviving the death of the brain, physicists were developing a theoretical framework that could explain how this is possible. Sir Roger Penrose, one of the most decorated physicists of the 20th century, Nobel laureate, Stephen Hawking's longtime collaborator, the man who proved that black holes are an inevitable consequence of general relativity, proposed, along with anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, a theory called orchestrated objective reduction, or ORC-OR. The theory proposes that consciousness arises from quantum processes occurring inside structures called microtubules, protein lattices within the neurons of the brain. These microtubules, according to Penrose and Hameroff, are capable of sustaining quantum coherence, the same phenomenon that allows particles to exist in multiple states simultaneously to be entangled across distances, and to collapse into definite states only when observed. In the Orc-Or model, consciousness is a quantum process. It arises from the interaction between the brain's microtubules and the fundamental structure of space-time itself. The brain is a receiver of consciousness, the way a radio is a receiver of a signal. The signal exists independently, the radio is the receiver, and when the radio breaks, when the brain dies, the signal continues. This is a radical claim. It upends the materialist assumption that has dominated neuroscience for a century, that consciousness is produced by the brain and dies with the brain. Penrose and Hameroff are saying the opposite. Consciousness is fundamental to the universe. It is woven into the fabric of space-time at the quantum level. The brain accesses it, channels it, filters it, but the brain is the instrument. The consciousness is the source. If Orc-Or is correct, then the findings of the AWARE studies make perfect sense. When the brain flatlines, the filter shuts off. The constraints that ordinarily limit consciousness to the narrow band of sensory input required for physical survival are removed, and awareness expands explosively, vividly into dimensions of perception that the operating brain was actively suppressing. Death in this framework is the removal of a filter. It is the signal breaking free of the receiver. The evidence of quantum effects in biological systems has grown steadily since Penrose and Hameroff first proposed the theory in the 1990s. Quantum coherence has been demonstrated in photosynthesis, in the navigation systems of migrating birds, and the olfactory receptors of the nose. The objection that the brain is too warm, too wet, and too noisy for quantum effects to persist has been systematically weakened by each new discovery of quantum biology in messy, complex biological systems. In 2022, researchers at Trinity College Dublin published findings suggesting that quantum gravity effects may indeed be detectable in brain processes, lending indirect support to the Penrose-Hameroff framework. Conversation is shifting. What was dismissed as fringe physics 20 years ago is slowly migrating toward the center of the debate about the nature of consciousness. And if consciousness is quantum, if it exists at the level of space-time itself, then asking whether consciousness survives death is like asking whether math survives the breaking of a calculator. The calculator was useful. It allowed certain operations to be performed in a specific format. But the mathematics it was computing existed before the calculator was built and will continue to exist after the calculator is destroyed. You are the mathematics. The body is the calculator. Hameroff has said it directly. When the heart stops beating, the blood stops flowing, and the microtubules lose their quantum state, the quantum information within the microtubules is released into the universe at large. If the patient is resuscitated, the quantum information can go back into the microtubules, and the patient says they had a near-death experience. If they are permanently dead, the information exists outside the body, perhaps indefinitely, as a soul. A Nobel laureate's collaborator working at the intersection of quantum physics and neuroscience using the word soul. 2,500 years before any of this research existed, Tibetan Buddhism produced the most detailed map of the dying process ever created. It is called the Bardo Thodol, commonly translated as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, though a more accurate translation is the Great Liberation Through Hearing in the Intermediate State. It describes with clinical precision the stages of consciousness that unfold between the moment of death and the moment of rebirth. The Tibetan model describes three bardos, three intermediate states that consciousness passes through after the body dies. The first bardo is the bardo of dying. As the body shuts down, the elements dissolve in sequence: earth into water, water into fire, fire into air, air into consciousness. Each dissolution produces specific inner experiences, visions of light, sound, and color that the dying person recognizes if they have been trained in the practice, and that overwhelm them if they lack preparation. At the moment of death itself, the ground luminosity appears, the clear light of the true nature of mind. This is the same clear light described in the sleep yoga traditions. It is the fundamental awareness that exists when all content, all thought, all sensation, all identity has been stripped away. If the dying person recognizes the clear light and merges with it, they achieve liberation. the cycle of birth and death ends, and they are free. Most beings fail to recognize it. The light is too bright, too overwhelming, too unfamiliar. The mind recoils from it and falls into the second bardo, the bardo of Dharmata, where peaceful and wrathful deities appear. These are understood in the Tibetan framework as projections of the mind's own energy, appearing in symbolic form. If the dying person recognizes them as projections, as their own consciousness appearing in dramatic costume, liberation is still possible at this stage. Most beings fail here as well. The visions are too vivid, too terrifying, too seductive. And so consciousness falls into the third bardo, the bardo of becoming, where it is drawn toward rebirth. The consciousness, driven by its habitual patterns, its attachments, its unresolved karmic momentum, is pulled toward a new life. It enters a womb, it forgets, and the cycle begins again. Now lay the Tibetan map over the clinical data from the AWARE studies. The tunnel of light reported by NDE survivors corresponds to the ground luminosity described in the first bardo. The life review corresponds to the panoramic vision that Tibetan teachings describe. The encounter with deceased relatives corresponds to the appearance of beings in the second bardo. The boundary or point of return corresponds to the threshold between the bardo of Dharmata and the bardo of becoming. These are independent systems of knowledge. The Tibetan lamas had no EEG machines. The AWARE researchers had no training in bardo navigation, and yet they are describing the same territory with extraordinary consistency. There is a dimension of the bardo teachings that rarely gets discussed, and it is in many ways the most unsettling element of the entire framework. The Tibetan Book of the Dead states plainly that from the moment of death for 3.5 to 4 days afterward, the consciousness of the ordinary deceased person exists in a trance state, unaware that it has been separated from the physical body. The consciousness continues to perceive, it continues to think, it continues to experience what appears to be a coherent reality, but it has died and it is completely unaware. E.J. Gold, in his remarkable book, The American Book of the Dead, a modern Western adaptation of the Tibetan Bardo teachings first published in 1974, and now in its 10th printing, explores this idea with extraordinary depth. Gold reframes the Bardo as a labyrinth, a series of macro dimensions that consciousness navigates after the body dies. He describes the voyager, his term for the newly deceased, as someone moving through a maze of perceptual spaces, each one vivid, each one convincing, each one presenting itself as reality. The voyager sees environments, encounters beings, experiences emotions, all of it indistinguishable from ordinary waking experience. And the central challenge of the labyrinth is the same challenge described in the original Tibetan texts, recognizing that you are dead. Gold designed his book as a practical manual, 49 days of readings to be performed aloud for someone who has died or is in the process of dying. The readings are intended to guide the voyager through the labyrinth, to help them recognize where they are, to remind them that the vivid reality they are experiencing is a projection of their own consciousness, and that liberation is available at every stage. If they can wake up inside the dream of death the way a lucid dreamer wakes up inside the dream of sleep. The book has been used by hospice workers, nurses, and families internationally since 1974. It was endorsed by Dr. John C. Lilly and Dr. Claudio Naranjo, and its central premise is the same one that runs through every framework we have examined in this episode. Consciousness survives the body, and what happens next depends entirely on whether the voyager is awake or asleep within the experience. But here's the implication that Gold's work and the original Tibetan texts force us to confront. If the newly deceased person can exist for days in a state of full perceptual experience without knowing they have died, if the reality they encounter after death is so convincing, so solid, so indistinguishable from the life they had just left that they continue going about their business without any awareness of the transition, then how would you know? How would any of us know? The Tibetan teachings suggest that many beings pass through the bardo of becoming and enter a new life without ever recognizing that they died. They simply, seamlessly, effortlessly, without any interruption in the continuity of their experience, find themselves in a new existence. The transition is so smooth that it is invisible from the inside. You would experience it as a continuous, unbroken life. You would have memories, relationships, a sense of identity, a sense of time passing. You'd eat food. Everything would feel real. Everything would feel like It had always been this way because the labyrinth presents itself as reality. That is its nature. That is its design. There's one more framework that belongs in this investigation. It comes from the Yogic tradition, and it adds a dimension that none of the other systems address with quite the same precision. Sadhguru, the Indian yogi, founder of the Isha Foundation, published a book called Death, an Inside Story that draws on decades of inner experience and the ancient yogic sciences to map the death process from the inside. The book became a national bestseller, and its teachings align with and expand upon the Tibetan Bardo framework in ways that are directly relevant to everything we've been exploring. Sadhguru teaches that the human body is a composite of 5 elements: earth, water, fire, air, and space. Life is the coming together of these elements into a coherent form. Death is their disintegration. This mirrors the Tibetan teachings of elemental dissolution: earth dissolving into water, water into fire, fire into air, air into consciousness. But Sadhguru expresses it through the yogic lens rather than the Buddhist one. Convergence between these two independently developed systems is remarkable. Both describe death as a sequential unwinding of the same elemental forces experienced from the inside as a series of perceptual changes. But here's the insight from Sadhguru that adds something critical to our investigation. He teaches that your state of mind at the exact moment of death has an enormous influence on your afterlife experience. Whatever interior experience you carry at the moment of transition, peace, terror, attachment, surrender, rage, or love, continues as your dominant experience on the other side. The emotional and psychological state you die in becomes the atmosphere of your disembodied existence. This is a staggering claim. And Sadhguru goes further. He teaches that after death, most people lose the capacity of the rational mind to discriminate between what is desirable and what is undesirable. The ability to choose, to redirect attention, to consciously shift your state. That ability dissolves with the body. What remains is pure impulse. Whatever pattern was dominant at the moment of death plays on repeat without the constant mind available to interrupt it or redirect it. You are carried by momentum alone. Think about what this means in the context of the Bardo teachings and E.J. Gould's labyrinth. The voyager moving through the macro dimensions after death is navigating with zero rational control. They're being pushed by the momentum of whatever they are feeling, thinking, and clinging to in their final moments. If that final state was terror, the labyrinth appears terrifying. If it was peace, the labyrinth appears luminous. The Bardo is the same territory for everyone. But the experience of that territory is entirely determined by the state of the consciousness passing through it. Sadhguru also describes Mahasamadhi, the voluntary, fully conscious exit from the body. This is the yogic tradition's highest expression of mastery over the death process. A being who has achieved complete awareness and complete detachment from physical existence simply leaves. There is zero panic, zero clinging, zero confusion. The yogi knows exactly what is happening, chooses the moment, and releases the body the way you would remove a coat at the end of the day. In the last years of his life, Neville Goddard said, "I know my time is short. I've finished the work I've been sent to do, and now I'm eager to depart." That statement carries the exact energy of Mahasamadhi, a conscious being who has completed the work and is ready to leave voluntarily. Whether Neville achieved literal Mahasamadhi is unknown, but the quality of his departure, the clarity and certainty of the eagerness suggests a level of conscious engagement with the death process that Sadhguru would recognize immediately. The practical implication of Sadhguru's teaching is urgent and direct. The work you do on your consciousness in this life is preparation for the transition. Every meditation, every moment of presence, practice of releasing attachment, and choosing a higher state of awareness is training for the moment of death. Because at that moment, you will have only what you have practiced. Your habitual state of consciousness will become your entire reality, and the question of whether that reality is luminous expansion into the clear light or a terrified tumble through the labyrinth depends entirely on what you've cultivated while you were alive. And then there's Neville Goddard, and Neville's model is the most radical of all. Neville taught us that when you die, you pass through a door. Death, he said, is simply a transition. On the other side of that door, you're instantly restored to a body of approximately 20 years of age. You're young. You're not a baby. You are whole. If you left this life old, sick, and injured, on the other side you arrive healthy, complete, and restored. And then you live again. You live an entire lifetime. You grow, you marry, you face challenges, you pursue goals, you suffer, you hope, you fear death, and you die again with the same fear of death you carried the first time, because the amnesia is total. You have zero memory of having lived before. You believe with absolute conviction that you are living for the first time. This is recursion. You loop through the experience of being human, sometimes in the same timeline, sometimes in a different timeline, sometimes in the future or in the past, until something finally breaks the cycle, until the promise unfolds within your consciousness and you awaken to what you truly are. Neville described meeting people who had died, encountering them in states that appeared to be dreams or visions, and finding them alive, young, going about their lives with zero awareness of having transitioned. He described these encounters as more vivid than waking life, more solid, more real. The people he met on the other side were living complete lives, eating, working, loving, worrying, in a world as tangible and detailed as this one. After my dad died, I, in a dream, met him, and he was 20 years old. He had no clue that he had died, and was talking to me as if it was just another day. In Neville's framework, there's zero punishment, zero judgment, zero karma in the retributive sense. There's only the continuation of the journey toward awakening, played out across as many cycles as consciousness requires, and when the promise arrives, when the divine spark within you ignites, and you recognize what you are, the recursion ends, the loop closes, you graduate from the system permanently. He said of the promise, you do absolutely nothing to earn it. It's a gift, it's all grace. And he said of the afterlife, you pass through a door. That's all that death is. You're restored to life instantly in a world like this, just this world, and you go on there with the same problems you had with no loss of identity. Think about what this means. In Neville's model, the man who died yesterday is alive today, with memories of having lived as a baby. He woke up in a body of 20 years old in a reality as solid as the one he left. He has a name, a family, a set of problems, a set of hopes. He is living a life with complete conviction and has zero awareness that he has done this before. The transition was so seamless that he experienced no interruption in the continuity of his selfhood. Death in this model is less dramatic than falling asleep on a cross-country flight and waking up in a different city. At least on the flight, you remember getting on the plane. Neville was also specific about something that distinguishes his model from almost every other framework. There is an exit. The recursion is finite. Every single being without exception eventually experiences the promise, the mystical awakening described in Scripture, and graduates permanently from the cycle. Timeline of this graduation varies. It may take what appears to be many lifetimes, but the outcome is guaranteed. There are zero exceptions. Everyone eventually wakes up. Everyone eventually remembers what they are. Compare this to the Tibetan model. The Tibetans describe a process where consciousness driven by habitual patterns and unresolved attachments is pulled toward a new birth and forgets its previous existence. Neville describes the same process using a completely different language, a door, a restoration, a world identical to this one, total amnesia. The structure is the same, the mechanism is the same. The difference is that the Tibetans describe it as a process governed by karma, while Neville describes it as a process governed by grace, moving inexorably, lifetime after lifetime, toward an inevitable awakening that every single being will eventually experience. So here's the picture that emerges when you lay all these frameworks on top of each other. Raymond Moody documented the pattern: tunnel, light, life review, deceased relatives, boundary return, 150 accounts, consistent across every variable. Pim van Lommel proved the pattern is real, prospective, and unrelated to oxygen deprivation, medication, or psychological expectation. I think that he's also accounting for DMT, which would be a chemical that's being released. 18% of cardiac arrest survivors studied in advance reported the experience. The depth of consciousness was inversely correlated with the loss of brain function, and the transformation was permanent, deepening over 8 years. Sam Parnia and the AWARE studies confirmed that consciousness persists during clinical death, that verified awareness occurs during flatline brain states, and that the brain that's dying produces electrical signatures of heightened consciousness precisely when it should be producing nothing. His team used the phrase new dimensions of reality. Penrose and Hameroff provided the theoretical physics. Consciousness is a quantum process that exists at the fundamental level of space-time. The brain is a receiver. When the receiver shuts down, the signal expands rather than terminating. Death is a removal of a filter. The Tibetan Book of the Dead mapped the territory 2,500 years ago. 3 bardos, progressive dissolution, the clear light appearing at the moment of death, the chance for liberation, the fall into rebirth, the amnesia, the cycle continuing. And Neville Goddard described the same process in language so simple that his audiences almost missed its radicalism. You die, you pass through a door, you wake up young in a world identical to this one, and you live again without any memory of having lived before. You do this until the promise arrives and the cycle ends. These systems were developed independently. They span 25 centuries. They include peer-reviewed medical research, quantum physics, Buddhist contemplative tradition, and the mystical visions of a Barbadian teacher in Los Angeles. They share zero institutional connection, they share zero methodology, and they converge on the same conclusions from 6 completely different directions. Consciousness survives the death of the body. It is expanded dramatically by the removal of the brain's filtering system. It enters transitional states where the totality of experience is reviewed and evaluated. It encounters a luminous reality that is described consistently across every tradition. 6 frameworks, 6 independent lines of investigation, 1 conclusion. All of this, and I haven't even discussed the books that I read on the channel by Anthony Borgia, Life in the Unseen World, which are channeled works where people are channeling people that are dead, speaking of heaven-like existences. I've also read really fascinating accounts consistently of people that when they die, they end up in a place similar to where they're at now. So if they're angry, they're with angry people. If they're happy, they're with happy people. The law of attraction working in the world of death, like attracts like. You are attracted to what is like you. I've certainly had several episodes where I discuss this, and I've read books and detailed accounts, and I'd love to get your comments on what you think, because I think in this existence, we're not meant to know. The not knowing is a part of this dimension. I want to tell you what this means for how you live today. This is about death, but the implication is entirely about life. If consciousness survives the body, if the evidence is pointing where it appears to be pointing, then everything you believe about the stakes of being alive changes. It means that the personality you're wearing, the body you're inhabiting, the circumstances you're navigating, all of it's temporary. A garment, a role, a chapter in a story that is vastly longer than a single lifetime. It means that the fear of death that sits beneath every other fear, the fear that drives accumulation, competition, aggression, anxiety, that fear is based on misunderstanding. You're terrified of something that is, according to every framework we have examined, a transition, a door, a shift in the dial of the receiver. I want to share something personal here because this material is deeply personal to me. I want you to understand why. Years ago, I was shot. A bullet hit me in the back, and by every reasonable assessment of physics, that bullet should have gone through me. It should have ended my life. Instead, it bounced off. It deflected. I walked away from an event that by any normal calculation of probability should have killed me. And I've thought about that moment for years. I've turned it over in my mind thousands of times because once you study the Bardo teachings, once you read E.J. Gould's description of the labyrinth, once you understand the Tibetan teaching that the newly dead person can exist for days in a state of full perceptual reality without any awareness that they have died, once you absorb Neville's description, a question emerges that you can never fully put down. Am I dead? Did I die that day? Am I exploring a consciousness that continued after the bullet did what bullets do? Because my life is too dreamlike. Sometimes I will say, this is not real. I would only dream of having a life like the one I have now. There's no way it could be happening. And I continually meet people that had near-death experiences, and I continually think that I'm still in a reality where I'm just with others that are going through this death process. Is this life? Everything that has happened since that moment, this channel, this community, these teachings, is all of it happening in a post-death reality that I entered so seamlessly that I have no awareness of the transition? I'm telling you this because I think many of you have had your own version of this question. A car accident you barely survived, an illness that should have taken you, a moment where the margin between being here and being gone was so thin that looking back, you're unable to fully explain how you made it through. And somewhere in the back of your mind, in the quiet hours, the question surfaces, did I make it through? Or did I transition and this is the world on the other side? If so, put it in the comments. The Tibetan teachings say this question is unanswerable from the inside That is the nature of the labyrinth. The bardo of becoming presents itself as reality. It feels solid. It has continuity. It has memories and relationships and the full texture of a lived life. Gold describes the voyager moving through the macro dimensions of the labyrinth, encountering environments that are indistinguishable from physical reality. And the entire purpose of the readings is to whisper into the voyager's consciousness, "You've died. This is the bardo. Wake up and recognize where you are." I'm sharing this because the implication is the opposite of frightening. If this is the bardo, if this reality is a labyrinth, the consciousness is navigating after a transition we already have forgotten, then the instructions for what to do are identical to the instructions every teacher in this episode has given. Wake up. Recognize the nature of the experience. Stop being carried by the momentum of habitual patterns. Become conscious inside the dream, and when you become conscious inside the dream, whether the dream is this life, the afterlife, or something the mind is unable to categorize, that is liberation. That is the promise. That is the entire point. And this is exactly what Neville meant when he said the Bible is about you, the resurrection is about you. It is happening inside your consciousness across multiple lifetimes in an arc of awakening that is guaranteed to reach its destination, because the intelligence running the system will accept nothing less than your total liberation. And it means that the work you do in this life, the inner work, the consciousness work, the imagination work, the practice of assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled, the practice of revision, the practice of living from the end, all of it accumulates. It carries forward. The Tibetans teach that spiritual practice performed in this life creates momentum that persists through the bardo and into the next incarnation. Neville taught that the recognition of your true nature in this life can break the cycle entirely. Both are saying what you do with your awareness matters beyond the boundary of this single lifetime. Every activation you listen to, every meditation you practice, every moment of conscious imagination where you choose a state of being and inhabit it with conviction, you are contributing to an arc of development that extends far beyond the few decades you will spend in this particular body. You are building something that death has no power to erase. Van Lommel's 8-year follow-up data makes this concrete. The people who had near-death experiences were permanently transformed. They lost their fear of death. They gained empathy. They shifted their values from accumulation to meaning, and these changes deepened over time rather than fading. The experience of expanded consciousness during clinical death created permanent structural change in how they inhabited their lives. You have the same capacity for transformation available to you every single day, without the cardiac arrest. Every time you enter the state akin to sleep, every time you practice assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled, every time you choose to inhabit a state of consciousness that reflects who you are becoming rather than who you appear to be, you are doing voluntarily what the NDE does involuntarily, removing the filter, accessing the expanded awareness, touching the luminous ground that the Tibetans call the clear light and that Neville called the I Am. The resurrection machine is already running. It runs during meditation, during sleep. It runs at 3 a.m. when the filter's thin. It runs every time you close your eyes and imagine a reality that is yet to manifest. And it will run at the moment of your physical death when the filter comes off completely and you discover what the NDE survivors and Tibetan masters and Neville Goddard have all been trying to tell you. You are infinitely more than the body you are wearing. In 2001, a Dutch cardiologist published the first prospective study of near-death experiences in The Lancet and wrote that there appears to be an inverse relationship between the clarity of consciousness and the loss of brain function. In 2014 and again in 2023, the AWARE studies documented verified awareness during clinical death and found the electrical signature of lucid consciousness in brains that were producing zero blood flow. A Nobel laureate's collaborator proposed that consciousness is a quantum process woven into the fabric of space-time itself, and that the death of the brain releases this quantum information back into the universe, perhaps indefinitely, as what he called a soul. 2,500 years ago, Tibetan masters mapped the territory of death with precision, and a man from Barbados who started life as a dancer became one of the most profound mystical teachers of the 20th century, described the same process in 3 sentences. You die, you pass through a door, and you wake up young in a world identical to this one. The resurrection machine is consciousness itself. It's been running since before you were born. It will continue running after your body stops. And the only question that any of this research is ultimately asking you is whether you will wake up inside the machine or whether you will let it carry you unconsciously through another cycle. The evidence says the machine is real. The traditions say it has a purpose, and the purpose is your complete, total awakening to what you have always been beneath every garment, every role, every lifetime. The resurrection is already happening inside you, and death, whenever it comes, is just the moment when the machine shifts gears. The cardiologists found it in their data, the Tibetans found it, Neville found it in the room at 30 West 2nd Street with an old man in a turban. About the journey of a divine being through the experience of being human, dying, forgetting, being reborn, inevitably waking up to what it has been all along. That being is you. That journey is your journey in the resurrection machine, the mechanism that carries you through death and back into life, that strips away the old garment and clothes you into a new one, that patiently, loving, relentlessly moves you toward awakening. That machine is already running. It's always been running. You have nothing to fear. You have everything to remember. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com, and welcome to The Reality Revolution.